for Friendship and Bloodshed, the Brief and Complicated History of the Dutch Native Wars, 1643 to 1644. Our speaker tonight is True Shubtar Rabus. He's a public historian who seeks to preserve the language, history, and culture of Eastern Woodlands people, particularly the Lenape, Nanticoke, and Southern Unami. He works as an Algonquian historical consultant with the New Amsterdam History Center and for the Maryland State Archives as a contractual research and preservation specialist, working with tribal oral histories. So thank you so much, Drew, and I'm going to let you take it away.
Hey, natadawensi pekadawas magadawi pokamok the napinak the lenu ne nekio skid na kino na nekio skid na Phillipsburg Manor. Natadawensi pekadawas magadawi. I am called Blackthorn of Pokamok the napinak the lenu ne Pokamok person and man. I am a tribal member and I am our cultural ambassador of the Pokamok Indian Nation. We are a small, unrecognized tribal community that live in the eastern shore of Maryland. Thank you all, and thankful for you and I, na Phillipsburg Manor Hall. I'm thankful for Phillipsburg Manor Hall. So thank you so much for joining us today. We do have one in-person participant. So I can see one person here, but I'm honored that so many of you came virtually. I'm very humbled and honored. Thank you so much. So today we're going to be talking about some of the early conflicts that happened in southern New Netherlands colony. So when we talk about New Netherlands colony, because so much of the Northeast history is made up of what do we know about Plymouth and Plymouth Rock and Massachusetts, and these other colonies such as New Netherlands and New Sweden and Maryland and Virginia start to kind of get swept away. Virginia gets a little bit of hype because of Jamestown, but colonies such as Maryland and New Netherlands and New Sweden, they kind of get pushed away a little bit. And we're going to be talking about those colonies. We're going to be talking about the conflicts, because when we think about these conflicts, they're not singular. They're not, monocyclical. They're not one thing. There's not only one track. It's many different fingers in all the same pie. Everyone is just involved in this. So when we talk about New Netherlands colony, we're talking about a colony that starts around, 16 teens. Of course, we all know of Henry Hudson going up the Hudson River in 1609, but nothing's really established till around the 16 teens, around 1613, and that's more in the Albany area. That's where you get Fort Orange and you get Beavervik, you get, which is all in the Albany area. But when we think about southern New Netherlands is around 1624, though we know itinerantly the Dutch are going back and forth through that area even as early as prior to Hudson. Even we know Verrazano is in the area in the 1520s. But the Dutch are starting to kind of migrate, trade, and move in this area around the 16 teens. And before I continue, if people have questions, please feel free to ask. I'm sure we have a chat bar that's in the, I'm sure it's there.
Yep.
And so please feel free to ask questions. You don't have to wait till the end. Just let me know, and I will answer your questions as we go. So to kind of continue, because I just segued a bit, and I apologize for that. So the Dutch are kind of itinerantly in southern New Netherlands. And when we're talking about southern New Netherlands, we're talking about the lower Hudson Valley. So we're kind of talking from Poughkeepsie down. For this instance, for this lecture, we're talking about southern New Netherlands. And by 1655 into 1664, southern New Netherlands is also going to encompass not only downstate New York, but it's also going to comprise western Connecticut, anything west of the Connecticut River. It's going to comprise all of New Jersey. It's going to comprise also all of Delaware by 1655. Now from, say, 1613 through to 1655, southern New Netherlands is anything from Poughkeepsie down through western Connecticut, which borders that southern tier of New York, but also New Jersey and Delaware. So when we think of southern New Netherlands colony, this is a colony that's run by the Dutch government. It's run by the West India Company, known as the WIC. Now the WIC kind of ran this colony Just as if Walmart could run a country. It had a board of directors that decided what the laws were going to be, who was going to settle, and why they were going to settle. Now, the Dutch weren't really interested in the same things the English were interested when they were starting to set up a colony. They weren't really interested in setting up a new Zion upon a hill, converting the Indians and bringing everyone into the folds of Christianity. They weren't really interested in even establishing a vast governing body in a new world, not great towns or great cities. They were interested in this. They were interested in furs. They were interested in what products and commerce that they could get from the new world. And so things like the beaver skin, or in my community, our word is pokiu, the beaver skin, or the muskrats, which this muskrat comes from my sister community's territory in Dorchester County, Maryland, which they still trap in the swamps there, in the marshlands there. They still trap muskrats. But the beaver furs were what was valuable. Now, why this big economy based on furs? Well, if you were someone living in the Netherlands colony, if you were a European at that time, there were very few ways that you could make your wealth. Very, very few ways. You could be born into it, of course. You could be born into a wealthy home and a wealthy house with station and privilege. You could become clergy, and that was one way to gain power and influence. You could also become a merchant. And the merchant class was one that was, by this period, starting to be burgeoning and starting to accrue wealth. But for your average European, there wasn't a lot of ways that you could become wealthy or make money for yourself. And so one way was through mercantile trade, such as the fur trade. Now in Europe at this period, so much of European landscape had changed from the time of the Roman Empire to the 17th century. And these vast forests that had been around in the Middle Ages were no longer there. And the animal populace that had been there in the Middle Ages, which is, we'll say for this conversation, is around the 400s through to around the 1500s, is when, we'll say around the 1300s is when the Middle Ages officially kind of ends and we start seeing the Renaissance period start. There are certainly academics who will argue that point. But because the forests are being cut down and this animal population is being hunted to virtual extinction, there's very few ways for people to, because one of the things that your average European could do besides farming, you could trap small game and you could fish. And so furs were one of these ways that Europeans could make money. Now in the 17th century, the Dutch were getting their furs from places like Ukraine, Sweden, and Norway. And they were getting their furs from what we would consider today Eastern Europe and the Slavic and Nordic countries. The problem was that the Dutch had to sail through the North Sea, go to Sweden, pay taxes, get the goods, and then go back, pay taxes again, and then sell their goods. Because furs were very important. This was a way that you could keep warm in the wintertime. Remember, all you had for homes were fireplaces. And the houses were not nearly as insulated as the homes we have today. They were built very differently. And so furs were one of these things that people needed in order to keep warm. It was also a way to show wealth and status by decorating your clothes with fur. The other important reason of fur was that by the 17th century, as a man, the only way to go outside if you were a well-to-do person was to wear a broad black hat. Now these hats were made of fur felt, and even today the finest hats that you can buy, Stetsons for one, are made of fur felt, and that's why they cost hundreds of dollars. Now what fur in particular? Well, you can use a variety of fur. Rabbit fur was the one that was common in Europe. But the most prized, the most desirable fur for these hats were beaver furs and beaver pelts. Now there were beaver in Eastern Europe and in the Slavic countries, and there were beaver that used to live in Central Europe, but those have been hunted out. Those have been trapped out, and now the Dutch have to go all the way to Norway and to Sweden to get pelts that had come maybe from Central Russia, that had migrated westward and westward till they got to Norway and Sweden and to the markets in Oslo and in Norway. And so the Dutch, being the adventurous merchants that they were, figured they wondered if there was an easier way. And so going to North America, one of the things they found was that the Algonquin people they met were adorned with furs, deer skins, bear skins, otter skins, muskrats, beavers. Among my people, the Pocomo, one of our sachems was described as wearing some of the finest beaver and otter skins of the country as his mantle. And that struck many of these poor sailors that lived on these ships. Now, for the native people that lived in the area, these furs had served mostly their purpose. They had been worn and they were used, and for the things that Europeans had, as knives and kettles and axes and small trade things, these furs, which were abundant to them, were an easy sell. They were an easy thing to trade, and to trade for goods that to them served a far more valuable purpose and were far more useful than old ratty furs. One of the things that the French described is that the finest furs were said to come from Canada. And the reason why is because when native people, we would wear the furs, wear them on our body. Not only can you wear them skin side, but what we know through primary documentation is that these mantles that were worn by Algonquin people often had painted designs, which would indicate that the fur side is being worn over the skin. Now, that's mentioned in many, many documents. History of Westchester County, it's mentioned in many, many places, and there are some examples that still exist today. Now, the issue with that is you wear that mantle with that fur that goes over your skin. You wear it for a long time, and that brown outer fur starts to wear off. And that dark under hair starts to show. And it starts to get kind of greasy and kind of slippery. And the reason why is because that skin is absorbing all the salts and all the oils from your body. And so these pelts that these French fur traders and likely these Dutch traders were getting were what we would consider so ratty and so gross that when they went to go be made into fur felt for hats, that they had already gone through part of the tanning process. And so it made it easier for these pelts to then be used for the hatting industry. So why have I pontificated so much about furs and the fur trade? Because this was the lifeblood for Algonquin people. This was how Algonquin people were able to acquire things like firearms, things like knives, kettles, and other useful goods that came from Europeans. We know through the writings of Adrian van der Donck that by at least 1647, they were pulling out of Albany. They were pulling out of Fort Amsterdam about 80,000 beaver skins a season. They were sending back to what they called Patria, which is the Netherlands proper in Europe. 80,000 beaver skins a season, every year, 80,000 skins. And so that demand causes catastrophic implications on the environment. It causes populations to dwindle. No longer are Algonquin people hunting, fishing, farming just for themselves and their communities. Now, with incoming Europeans, these Europeans who don't have food, or whose food has gone bad quite a long while since they've been on ship, and they need food, and they'll trade virtually anything for food, for fresh food, for fresh produce, for anything that you can grow, but also not only for your old furs, but for any kind of food you can give them too. This causes catastrophic implications for the environment. And these implications and these catastrophes in the environment to suit a new population, it causes some of these conflicts to begin. And so what happens is, traditionally as Algonquin people, we lived what Europeans recorded as feast-famine lifestyle, meaning that when we had plenty, we ate, there was a lot. These were in the spring, in the summer, and in the fall, going into the early winter, when there was plenty of food. We were hunting, fishing, trapping, all of that food was coming to us. In the winter time is a starving time, because you have saved food in the summer and in the fall to save for the winter time, and eventually you run out of that food. And it's all food that's been dried, that's been stored, that's been carefully prepared to last for many months. And so, in that cycle, you bring in a new population of people that now require more and more land because they have livestock. cows and sheep and pigs and goats, animals you've never seen before, that you have no words to describe what they are, but they cause incredible damage to your crops. The Europeans don't fence their animals, and they let them roam free, and you have never had a desire, or people never had an understanding or a desire to fence in their own fields. There was no need. And these animals start to encroach on these fields and get into people's homes. These animals get killed, and it leads for more conflict. And so all of these things encapsulate, they roll themselves into a ball. And it's one small conflict, one argument between neighbors, one dispute, a murder, a fight, a brawl, that leads into these larger conflicts. And so now that I've kind of set the stage, I'll kind of start going into the conflict. And so the first conflicts that we really see is during the directorship of Willem Kieft. So the way that the Netherlands was set up was through a directorship. They didn't have governors or presidents. They had what was called a director general, which we would call today CEO. We would call, or board chair. And the director general pretty much had the same responsibilities as a governor or as a royal consul or as a royal governor, had pretty much the same responsibilities. The only issue that was different was that they were not beholden to a king, they were beholden to a company. And they had usually what was called a schout and a schepen. Schout, who was a lawyer, in this case in the 1640s. You had a man named Adrian van der Donck, who was the schout. He was the legal representative of the West India Company. So whenever the company, which was also its parent, I think it's a sister group, or I'm not sure what the legal or corporate term would be, because this is the parent company, and then this would be the offshoot, would be the colony from the parent company. Subsidiary. So the subsidiary of the company, which is New Netherlands Colony, which is very weird to think about. It would be essentially as if Walmart decided to buy half of Brazil and make a country, and the president of that country was not beholden to the people, he was beholden to the company and was a corporate representative of the company's interests. It's really weird to think about, but it happened. And it happened for around almost 70 years it happened. And so most of these issues happened in the directorship of Willem Kieft. And so the directorships usually lasted for 4 to 8 years. Most of the directors prior to Kieft had been middling to incompetent. Wouter van Twiller, who was the director prior to Kieft, was sent back to Patry on corruption charges, was known as a pretty heavy drinker. A lot of people in the colony were related to the Rensselaers and the Rensselaer family, and most of the patroonship, you had to either know the Rensselaers or be related to the Rensselaers, and it got kind of very inbred at a point. But this man, Willem Kieft, comes in around 1638, around 1638-39, comes to the colony. And from the get-go, this man is terrible. He's terrible not only from a contemporary sense, where we in our luxury can sit back in our nice leather armchairs and point and say terrible, but even people that lived in his own time hated the man and considered him an oath, a monster, and a war criminal in his own time. And that, to me, as a historian, not only as a native person, but as a historian, speaks volumes, is when people who were alive and knew the man face to face called him a monster to his face. Kieft was someone who was ambitious, who was a corporate man. He was someone who saw themselves as being representative of good, honest Christian values and what the company desired, and believed that he could make himself a good name in this company, and that these Indians just had to be brought under Christianity by hook or by crook, and that, you know, as long as the churches were built in his name, things would be good. And that didn't work. He had no military experience. He was of a middling background. He was not a very large power player, nor was he connected to any large, powerful family. And so in 1640-41, one of the major settlements that starts on and off to be settled in southern New Netherlands colony is Staten Island. Staten Island is named for the Staats General, which is the governing body of the Company of West India Company, with the Staats General because the Netherlands does not have a king. They have what's called Staats General, which is kind of parliament, and eventually they do have head of parliament, which becomes William of Orange, and then he becomes king, and it gets really weird and really complicated because he's the king of two countries, but he's still kind of the head of the Staats General, but he's still the king of England, so it gets weird. And so Kieft is director during this period, and so Staten Island is named after the Staats General, and the first settlement is by a man named David Pietersen de Vries. And de Vries is a really interesting, he's one of these interesting people that come to New Netherlands who are what we would consider today, some of them, such as Adrian van der Donck, very early proto-anthropologists. There is no field of anthropology or archaeology as we know it at the time. They would be termed as what would be called natural scientists. There's really no term for them at that period. It's one that we now would call them natural scientists. But they were very interested in people and culture and language, and they were interested in botany. They were interested in all these things that were new to them. And men like de Vries and van der Donck wanted to learn from native people. They did not hate native people. Now, they saw them as different. They saw them not the same as themselves. They were men of their time who were governed by Christian theology, and so that theology governed their ways of thinking. But they believed that these native people, if they had been created by God, so had the native people, and that they just had a different language and background, and that if they showed them Christianity in hopes they would uptake Christianity and eventually live like Dutchmen, and everyone would be happy, so to speak. But men like van der Donck and de Vries were interested in native people. They wanted to learn from them. They wanted to learn their languages, their customs, their culture. What did they call places? What kind of foods did they eat? These writings that de Vries and van der Donck write, and van der Donck writes in 1647, de Vries writes his journal from 1638 to 1644, are incredibly important for us now because they paint a picture of an area that has drastically changed since the time they were alive. It paints a picture of the people that lived in this area, the customs and language and culture they had, and in some cases still continue to have. And so de Vries tries to set up a patroonship. Now, these patroonships were small fiefdoms, land holdings, governed by a single individual who had several colonists to work on there to pay their debts, and they would farm the land. And so Pietersen starts his patroonship 1638 into 1640. This leads us into our first conflict because he has pigs, he has hogs. Now, for native people, like we said earlier, traditionally Algonquian people did not fence in their cornfields, which contained our corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters. Now, by this period of the middle 1600s, that corn, beans, and squash, those were our lifeblood. That's what sustained us. That was, to the Polynesian, their taro root. It is what sustained us. Now, to feed a family of four for an entire year off of what you grew, it would take 1,000 mounds of corn, beans, and squash to feed a family of four for an entire year. Now, imagine a village of 50 to 200 people, the average size of a small to middling Algonquian village. That's about maybe several hundred acres of corn, beans, and squash to feed everyone in that entire village. Even 20 mounds, 40, 50 mounds, would drastically affect a family. Drastically affect a family's ability to feed themselves, because not only would you eat that food once it was harvested, you would also save a lot of those seeds and dry them for the next year's crop. We would then dry those seeds, we would store them in great woven bags, and bury them in pits underground and bury them to keep the seeds below the frost line, but also in cold storage so that they would preserve and keep for the next planting season, because there were no refrigerators at that time. But our Algonquian ancestors were smart. They were just as smart as anybody alive today, and they understood that since exploring caves, they must have understood, and also digging holes, that they understood that if you dig deep enough and go deep enough under the ground, that the temperature stays cold and that temperature stays constant. And that if you keep things in caves, and if you keep things deep enough underground, that it will be below a frost line, and the ground will still be soft, but it will be cold, and things can preserve very well. And so what happened was that these pigs start getting out of hand, and they start going into people's cornfields. Now, we had no love for those animals. We did not understand the Europeans' understanding of property with those animals. We saw an animal that did not belong to us, that was trampling on our food, and so we shot it, and we ate it. And we know in other colonies, such as Maryland, there are legal notices that are put out that warn colonists of buying meat from the Indians, beef or pork, because it was illegally harvested beef or pork that these native people were selling them. And so this conflict arises, and pigs are missing. Now, Kieft points the finger at the Raritans, who are living on Staten Island. The Lenapes are blamed too, but the Raritans are mostly have the finger wagged. And the Raritans are blamed for killing hogs. Now, the Dutch had known that native people were known for killing livestock. They were killing the livestock because they were damaging their corn. And so Kieft decides to send out a militia to teach the Raritan a lesson. And so in that winter, he goes to a Raritan village at night with his men and kills men, women, and children in their sleep and leaves. The Raritans see this, they are alarmed and they are enraged, and they attack the unit, kill almost everybody. Kieft tries to get another unit going, but the people say no, that it was not worth their time, they didn't want to do it. And it ends up being found out that it wasn't the Indians who were killing these hogs, it was corrupt WIC employees that were stealing these hogs. And that the Indians were just an easy fall man. They were just an easy setup. And so this is our first conflict. That leads to distrust. And our second conflict, 1642. Now, De Vries has left by 1641 because one of the issues that happens is that because of this, the Raritan then swear they will burn De Vries's farm, and they burn it. They kill his hogs, and they kill 4 of his men that are working on the farm. So Staten Island is burned once, and De Vries's patroonship is abandoned. Also because there's very little resources on Staten Island. It's known as Aqueonga Manaknon, a place of bad woods, which has multiple meanings and interpretations. But one interpretation is there's not a lot of potable water on Staten Island. And that's an issue if you have lots of people and you have lots of farm animals that need water. So this now leads us into the patroonship of Cornelius Mellon, who brings 42 settlers around 1641-42. Now, Mellon is there in Staten Island, and so one of the issues now also, besides the animals, the livestock wandering through people's fields, is this guy, this little jar, this little bottle, which looks very unassuming, almost cute, with this little face on it, but this bottle held our destruction, held our anger, it held our fears, and it held our rage. This is a Bartman jug, and at the period, only one thing usually came in a Bartman jug: rum. Rum, whiskey, and brandy. Brandy, which was the aqua vitae of its period. Brandy was everywhere in the Netherlands colony. It was a favorite drink of the Dutch. And brandy was produced here from the apple crops that the Dutch would produce. But we as native people had never used alcohol before. It was not a part of our traditional culture. We had never made it. And so we were very new to alcohol and alcoholic beverages, and it caused great devastation in our community. And in some places, it still continues to create great devastation. It was said that the first native person to get drunk was on the ship of Henry Hudson himself. The man in red, as Heckewelder describes, and that this, we believe, either Lenape or Mohican man, we're not really sure to the identity of this individual, was brought aboard ship, and Hudson had given him a small drink of what is believed to be rum or brandy or whiskey. We're not sure what the drink was. But what we know is that this native person drank this drink, was drunk, falling on the ground drunk within minutes, and had come to and said it was one of the most powerful visions that he had ever had. And it starts this cycle. Now, the term that in the 17th and 18th century that many of the Algonquin people in southern New Netherlands used for alcohol is bessen. Bessen is this word over and over and over again that is recorded being used. Bessen is recorded by both Heckwelder, and bessen is also recorded in Dutch writings from the Esopus, from up near Kingston, it's recorded. But bessen is this word for alcohol. And the term that native people say that when they drink it and they get drunk, they use this word, it's a Dutch corruption, they use the word cachez, which the Dutch write. It's a corruption of an Unami Munsee word, but it literally means crazy. And they literally were saying that it made them crazy. And so the alcohol caused issues. And one of the things that the Europeans realized very quick was that the Indians were very pliable when they were drunk, when they were intoxicated, when they were inebriated. They're very pliable to terms of trade, much more so than when they were sober. When delegation could take days, could take weeks of talking from the oldest person to the youngest child, explaining what they thought and explaining their feelings. And so Europeans learned very fast that if they wanted quick deals with native people, especially traders that were trading in furs and in peltry, if they wanted quick deals with native people, they might loosen their lips with alcohol. There were many times where native people were robbed, had land stolen because of that alcohol. Because alcohol was given knowingly at times that it would make the native people pliable to terms of trade. At other times, native people asked for it. And at other times, Europeans would say, well, we were required to pay them, and the only thing I had to pay them was alcohol. And they were agreeable to this term of sale. And so, whether it was to our desire for it, for something that we wanted that we shouldn't have had, or whether it was given us in malice, alcohol caused great problems. And in 1642, alcohol played its role. Now, there's two scenarios of the Whiskey War in Staten Island in 1642, and we're leading up to our main conflict of Kuyp's War. But you need to know these two conflicts because it's an Ania. It'll help you understand the distrust of Kieft, because all through this time, Kieft is Director General. Now, in 1642, Kieft also goes to many of the native communities, and he says, we demand a tribute from you because we have been protecting you with our guns and our soldiers and our fort. We demand from you corn, we demand from you peltries, and we demand from you water. And if you wish to have our protection from our fort and from our guns and from our soldiers, you will give us these things, and you will produce them at the state. The native people were for it. One Tappan chief said to David Peterson de Vries, who is this man? He must be a very disagreeable fellow to come to this country uninvited by us and demand our corn for nothing. We do not desire any protection from him and his fort. And so Kieft then said, okay, if you wish not to give me these corn, this peltries, or this wampum, I shall make you give me these things. Now, at this period, too, New Netherlands was a very sparsely populated colony. There's not a lot of settlers compared to New Netherlands. Excuse me, compared to New England, or even New France. There's not a lot of settlers. And so what the Dutch start to do, they start to welcome English immigrants coming from New England who were of varying degrees of despots, war criminals, soldiers for hire, who we would call mercenaries, religious zealots, among them Anne Hutchinson, who rebelled against the Massachusetts Bay Colony, saying that no, God had not made his choice and had chosen those who would go to heaven, and that would be that. She dared to say to the Massachusetts Bay, to the elders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony of the church, that through good works and through prayer, everyone was eligible to go to heaven, and that heaven was not preordained. This, of course, she had many followers. Among her was the mercenary, war criminal, and soldier, John Underhill, a very powerful man who had committed atrocities in 1637 against the Pequots, where he had killed Pequot men, women, and children
rounding them in their longhouses and wigwams and lighting them on fire, and saying, quoting the Bible as he did so, "As it was done in the Bible, so shall we do it here." Underhill and Hutchinson are thrown out of New England, and Willem Kieft welcomes them with open arms and says, "The only thing that you must do, my friends, is swear allegiance to the West India Company, to the States General, accept me as your Director General, and now you are vassals to me, particularly you, Mr. Underhill, are my vassal and servant. But if you serve me faithfully, you serve the company faithfully, I will award you these patents for land, and you may settle here, be industrious, and have children, and marry, and do the things that you must do." Underhill is given land in Hampstead. Hutchinson is given land in the Bronx, a place called Split Rock. Now, though the Dutch gave these patents to these Europeans, they never bought the land from the native people. And through this period, and we'll learn this through our conflict in 1642, native people weren't always compensated for land. It wouldn't be till 1661 that it was enshrined in law that native people had to be compensated for land, and that it had to be agreeable to them. The issue is that most of this land that the Dutch were getting, a lot of it, not all of it, but a lot of it, was not being bought fairly, was not being purchased fairly. And so, in 1642, you get the Whiskey War. And there's two scenarios of what happens with the Whiskey War. One is that a party of Dutchmen and a party of Indians were trading on one of the beaches in Staten Island. Now, the Indians get very drunk. They're plied with alcohol, poured from these jars, drink after drink, cup after cup, laughter, smoking, and games, and what have you. Either in the drunkenness of the native people or in their stupor while they were asleep, all of their furs and all of their wampum was stolen from them and taken from them. The Indians demand satisfaction. They go to the Dutch court and they say, "Well, we have been robbed. We were plied with drink and had all of our things stolen. All of our furs were stolen, all of our wampum. Likely they had wampum with them, either in earrings or in bracelets, necklaces that were taken from them." And they said, "We demand, if not these things to be returned, at least satisfaction to be given to us in goods, in kind." The Dutch refused. Well, this angered the native people. And they burn the settlement. They burn the settlement of Staten Island. They burn Mellon, the settlement, to the ground. And it becomes abandoned again. Staten Island is burned for a second time. The second scenario of the story is that there was a distillery said to be built on Staten Island. The first whiskey distillery in the country, it was said to be. Built by our favorite golden boy of the Netherlands, Willem Kieft, who was said to have built this distillery for his use. Alcohol was a very expensive commodity, it was a very valuable commodity. Kieft had also placed taxes on alcohol, and it would make sense that maybe he was distilling his own for his own consumption, and because he was Director General, maybe so he could elude those taxes, so to speak, since he was, I'm certainly certain in his mind, a little bit above the law. Well, the land that Kieft builds his distillery on is not purchased from the native people. And the Lenapes go to the Dutch court in Fort Amsterdam, and they say, "This land that you have built this distillery on is a beautiful distillery, but you have not paid us for this land. You have not given us anything in kind for this land. We demand satisfaction." The Dutch refuse, and they burn Staten Island to the ground in retribution. Now, where's the truth in this whole thing? Because I've given you two different stories. Well, likely, it's somewhere in the middle. What we know from the documents is that multiple cases through the late 1630s into the 1640s, there were lots of accounts of native people being plied with alcohol, given alcohol, being robbed, and then killing the offender. Isaac de Rossière, who's a Dutch merchant and trader, explorer, he writes a wonderful journal to his patroon of Samuel Blommaert. Blommaert, who I believe is married into the Rensselaers. Blommaert, who was his patroon, he writes a letter from 1625 to 28. And he writes of the Indians of Long Island, and this is central Long Island. He says they believe in consanguinity to the 8th degree, meaning that They believe that 8 generations back, they are all interrelated. And they believe in injury from generation to generation. Unless it is appeased, they are a revengeful people. And so, to the native people's mind, we traditionally believed, our Algonquian ancestors believed in balance. There is a Mohican word, Maui. Maui means whole, wholeness or all. And so balance was very important for Algonquian people. Balance in all things, whether it was balance in life, in spirituality, in the world, the water, which the world could be the mountains, the hills, the waters, the marshes. And if balance was not there, balance could cause sickness, physical sickness, such as cough, cough, sniff, sniff. You could die, that kind of sickness, spiritual sickness. It could cause sickness in the land, which could be bad harvests. It could be bad fish runs. It could be bad animal seasons where the animals that had been given birth, they weren't healthy or strong. And so balance was very, very important. Very important. And so when balance in your family was not there, it could cause massive problems, massive disruptions. And so balance was very important. And so to the native people's mind, they believe in a Hammurabi code of law, an eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, this retribution violence, where it was perfectly acceptable to kill people who had harmed you or had harmed family members in order to restore balance. And so what we know is that multiple times there are native people who are gotten drunk, have their things stolen, and they end up killing the offenders, or vice versa, and these small conflicts ensue. This leads us then to the corn taxes. Now, the native people sometimes balked and refused to pay these taxes because 20 years earlier, they had the Pequots, who Isaac de Rossière says that the Shinnecox and the Siwanogs were vassals to the Pequots. And the Pequots in that period were also asking for tributes. They said, if you did not give us these tributes, we will come down and burn your village, and we will take what we desire. And these tributes were the same things, such as corn, furs, and wampum. And so the people had a very long memory and remembered what had happened with the Pequots and said, no, we do not desire your protection. We do not wish to pay your taxes. And that's that. Well, Underhill, well, not Underhill, but Kieft, he didn't like the sound of that. And so he employed his newly established vassal and called upon him, John Underhill, and said, Underhill, I have a job for you. And he said, use what force is necessary to acquire this tribute. And Underhill did, with several English mercenaries, all veterans likely of the Pequot War of 1637, would go into Indian villages, torturing men, torturing people, cutting off genitalia, stuffing them in people's mouths, dragging people in the bay by the back of the ship, tying a rope to that person's body and dragging them in the bay back and forth, back and forth. Now, some may argue that these tactics were specifically done to native people, but the sad truth is Underhill and men like him were veterans of war. They were veterans of war against Spain. They were veterans in many other conflicts, and this was the way of war of the 1650s in Europe, the Middle East, and all over the Old World. This was the way of war. These same tactics would have been done to Irishmen, to Scots, to Jews, to all others. And so it wasn't specifically to native people, but Underhill was a soldier, and likely he saw himself as doing his duty to his patron, who had gifted him a very fine estate, and to cleanse the world of what Underhill probably believed was a lesser race that deserved to be wiped out. And so this enraged many of the native people. Underhill and his, for a lack of better word, goons, going into towns, murdering, torturing individuals, and forcing taxes. Now, when people demanded wampum, wampum is measured by fathom. And a fathom of wampum is a unit of 6 feet. It is a strand that is 6 feet long. It comprises around 280 beads. The best wampum makers, wampum is made in the wintertime. It is a shell bead made of whelk and quahog shell. It was used for everything: births, marriages, deaths. It had socio-spiritual significance for Algonquian people, meaning both significance in society and spirituality. It was used for everything. It was worn on necks. It was worn on wrists. It was worn as belts that decorated the body, headbands that went over women's heads, that decorated their hair, that held their hair back. The best wampum makers were said to make about 30 beads in a day. So to make a fathom of wampum might take 2 months, 3 months of working every single day making beads. Men like Kuyt were demanding fathoms of 200, 400, 500 bushels of wampum beads. The amount of beads we're talking were beads that literally every belt, every precious object they would have had would have needed to have been cut up, put into a basket and given. These belts that held stories, oral histories, spirituality, treaties, some of them that may have been hundreds, thousands of years old by that period, for all we know, were asked to be cut up and given to the Dutch. And so the amount that the Dutch were asking were monstrous, and the native people at times just didn't have it. We also know that, too, there's pressure coming from the north from other groups, such as the Mohicans and the Mohawks, the Mohawks and the Iroquois who don't have any wampum in their territory. They're inland. They have no ocean shells. And so they know that if their allies, the Dutch, who are very close with the Mohicans and the Mohawks in Fort Orange and in the upper Hudson, if they can be influential and advise that their Dutch allies should attack these Indian groups and exact wampum from them, these groups can then migrate farther and farther down, using the guns that they've acquired from Dutch traders, which many of the local people did not have. Firearms were in the minority in the lower Hudson Valley. Most of the people, they had bows and arrows still, made of hickory or elm that they were using. Now some did have firearms, but they weren't as numerous as along the Iroquois as the Mohicans in the upper Hudson. And so these groups then start to come down thinking that there's a plentiful amount of furs and wampum. They start driving raids into these areas, pushing native people down. We know from Milford, Connecticut, that during this period of 1642 or 43, that Mohawks are coming down to Milford, Connecticut, demanding tribute in wampum beads, or else they threatened that the Mohawk would come and burn down the Indian villages that were there. And we do know of one instance where the Mohawks did exactly that. And so conflict is now beginning to arise. This leads us into 1643 to 45, our conflict. Now, the author Grummett will argue that Kuyt's War begins in 1640, but Jaap Jacobs will say that it's from 1643 to 45. So, for our purposes, we're going to say that Kuyt's War is from 1643 through to 45. But there is contention there among scholars who have differing opinions. 1643. Tensions are high. It's not doing good. Warfare and conflicts are spotty. Little fires that keep bursting up, and one foot goes to put them out, another foot goes to put them out. The fires just keep erupting out of the ground. Anne Hutchinson is living in Split Rock, and this is around August of 1643. Some say September. She's living in Split Rock, which is now the Bronx. Split Rock Park is still there. You can actually visit where her settlement was. She's living there in 1643. This is Siwanog land. Now, in Sarah Hutchinson's mind, she has been given a patent from the Dutch government that says she is able to live here, that her and her party are able to live there. But the problem is, though the Dutch, I'm sure, told her that this land was purchased from the native people, and she was given a lawful Dutch patent, this land had never been purchased from the Siwanog people that lived there. And so the Siwanog had been watching her, seeing her build her cabin and her fence and all these other things. And so the story goes is that party of Siwanog go in, they see James Sands, the man that was working for her building, they pack up his tools, give him his hatchet, put it in his hand, put it on his shoulder, and tell him to go. That this is not their land and that they are not welcome here. Hutchinson and her party refuse to leave. Well, this doesn't sit well with the Siwanogs. And we know around the end of August, Wampag, who some believe is the origin of the word rampage, comes from Wampag, Wampag the First, and a party of warriors, we don't know how many warriors were with him, attacked the Hutchinson settlement. They attacked the Hutchinson settlement, killing not only Anne Hutchinson, most of the people that were in her party, most of her children except one. And they said scalps were taken. Even one of the children were beheaded, though I argue that because children were very valuable, especially child captives were very valuable for Native people because so many individuals in Native society were dying from disease, from smallpox, from cholera, from influenza. And it wasn't that Native people had a deficiency in these diseases, it's just that their populations had not been used to these diseases as old world populations had, and that their populations were already small. And so the impact of these devastating diseases were catastrophic. And so imagine seeing a party of 8 Native people in the spring, and then come fall, or a party of 10, and come fall in the springtime, and then come fall, only 8. 8 are gone. There's only 2 left. And so children were very, very important, especially European children, because they could be taken as captives and then adopted into Native community and be raised, replacing children who had died or individuals who had died, and taking the place which we know as mourning board, which was very common among Iroquois peoples, but Algonquin peoples practiced this as well, and taking those children and adopting them. Susanna Hutchinson was one of these children who were taken by Wampag and his people. Susanna was a captive for around 6 to 8 years. She was said to have been 7 years old when she was taken. Some people claim that she gave birth to Wampag II, a child of Wampag I. My personal belief is that this is incorrect because it would go against the Algonquian kinship system. Now, first cousin marriage was acceptable in the traditional Algonquian kinship system because you did not know your father's sister's family. They were a different clan than you, so you would not know them directly. And marrying inside your clan would have also been seen as incestual, so seen to marry outside your clan would have been acceptable kinship pattern. So for Wampag to have not only had relations with a child who may have been 7 years old, not only would have been impossible for her to conceive at that period, even if he had waited several years when she had a menstrual cycle, it would have been seen as incredibly incestual. It would have been not tolerated in that community, and it would have been an incredible taboo. And someone of Wampag status, who he then names himself Anhook, or Anne's Hook, because in Siwanog tradition, the Siwanog are said to be members of the Wappinger Confederacy, though we don't entirely know, but it is said that they were. It was the custom of the Siwanog people to name yourself after great deeds or great people that you had conquered in battle or taken in battle. And so he names himself Anhook, or Anne's Hook. And so in his mind, think of it this way. By taking Susanna, who had red hair, they gave her the name Kimpakwachokoku, or the autumn leaf, was the name that is said to have been given to her. By taking not only Susanna, in his mind, he is absorbing the family of Anne Hutchinson, who he must have learned from other people was so spiritually powerful that Massachusetts threw her away. That Massachusetts and the Puritans could not deal with her because she was so spiritually powerful. And so by him making Susanna his daughter, his kin, his child, he then absorbs the spiritual power and absorbs the ancestors of the Hutchinsons as his own. And so brings Susanna into his family and makes himself more spiritually powerful. Now that's not based in primary sources, that's my own personal opinion from everything I've read and what I understand of my Algonquian ancestors' culture and what I understand from primary documentation that talks about some of these things. It is likely that Susanna is said to have been the mother of this child because she probably took care of this baby when the mother had died from childbirth and had raised this child. In an Algonquin community, you are given a name when you have done great service, you've done a great deed, or you've shown yourself to be part of the community. And what better way to show yourself as part of the community by raising a child that isn't your own, and by taking a child and taking care of it that you had no, in any logical right to want to do. And so likely she was incorporated that way. We know that she is given back to her family in Boston around 8 years later, when she's around 16 or 17. After that, we don't know much about her. This leads us then through into 1643, into 1644. There are multiple conflicts that are happening in 1643, other killings that are going on. This leads us then into, and we also, in the summer of 1643 earlier, you have the killing of Claus Spitz. Claus Spitz was a wheelwright, he was a small-time merchant. And Claus ran also a small public house. Now, a young Wapwaskeek man, the Wapwaskeek people lived in Manhattan. They also believed to have territory into Greenwich. They were a small people, very, very close borders to the Siwanog, the Wampum people, Siwanog, the Wampum people. And so Claus Spitz brings in this young warrior into his house, this young man, who says, I wish to buy cloth. Claus Spitz sees nothing wrong with this. And so Claus brings this man into his home, turns his back to open a chest. The man pulls out a hatchet and cuts his head off and leaves. Now Keift is enraged. He says, you have murdered this man in cold blood for no other reason. Oratan, the sachem of the Hackensack, who is also one of the great paramount chiefs of many of the smaller tribes around that part of coastal New Jersey and parts of southern coastal New York, goes to Keift and meets with Keift, and he says, don't worry, I have it under control. This was a madcap, this was a crazy person that has gone to live with the Tonkitek farther north, but we will find this individual, and we will bring them to justice. However, Oratan then goes to his friend David Peterson DeVries, who's a trusted friend, and says, I know who killed this man, and it's the chief's son, and he will not be brought to justice. And so Keift then desires to meet with the chief of the Wapwaskeek. And the Wapwaskeek chief says to him, oh no, it was my son who killed that man. And the reason why he killed him was because 15 years earlier, that man killed his uncle, killed my brother. And so, to him, to the chief of the Wapwaskeek, this was not a murder at all. This was restorative justice. This was retribution. This was restoring balance to the family and to the kinship circle. And he then goes to say that he was sorry that 20 more Christians had not been killed. This, of course, did not sit well with Keift, and leads into other smaller conflicts. October of 1643, Pavonia which was from Augustus Pall, who sets up his colony, never visits the colony, never actually goes there, he just has land. It's just one of those things, I guess, where you buy a constellation, or you buy a planet, or you have a turtle out somewhere in the Pacific. I guess in the 17th century it was the same thing, where it's like, I have a piece of property in the New World, but I have it, it's in my name, and I've never been there. And so I hear it's nice, it has trees, and fuzzy animals, and the other things, woodland creatures. And so Pavonia, war party of Wapwaskeeks, Lenapes, Raritans attack Pavonia. Pavonia is evacuated, and all the settlers go into Fort Amsterdam. This leads us into the winter of 1644, February 24th, 1644. One of the darkest February nights in this area that this area has ever seen, known as the slaughter of the innocents. And because of the killing of Spitz, one of the things that Keift says is, he says, I will give wampum, and I will give beaver pelts for every Raritan head that is brought to the fort. Some of the Indians join in, and they bring in hands. They bring in heads of what we believe to be maybe Raritans, maybe other Indians. We don't know. We don't know how they're deciding that they're Raritans. It is likely that to Keift, an Indian was an Indian. It didn't really matter what tribal affiliation or, all he was looking for was for men probably with shaved heads and women with long hair, and that's what he was looking for. It didn't matter if they were men, women, or children. It didn't matter. And so the Europeans got him, bringing in heads of Raritans. bring in heads of other people, hands. We know one Tonkatech chief who's living here. This comes from Grummetsworth, the first Manhattans. One Tonkatech chief sends a hand to Kieft. And so these populations are then getting dwindled, smaller and smaller and smaller. And they're getting pushed into these almost refugee towns in Korleershoek, which Grummet described as Nechtang, or Korleershoek, and Pavonia. And we know that these people who have been attacked not only by settlers, other Indian peoples are huddled in these makeshift homes. They're huddled in huts that are there for Indian dignitaries, and that the colonists are giving them food. The colonists are giving them blankets. The colonists are watching over their children because they have nowhere to go. And so February 24th, 1644, around 10 o'clock in the evening, it's cold, it's quiet. Kieft gives the order. 12 men, the governing body of the colony, agree, and they give their stamp. Kieft gives the order. He tells Van Tienhoven to go with his men to Korleershoek. He tells Marin Adriaansen to go to Korleershoek, and Van Tienhoven to go to Korleershoek. And at night, while men, women, children are sleeping in their wigwams, in their shelters, deep in sleep, they attack. They fire and they cut to pieces men, women, and children with their swords, with their muskets, killing men, women, and children. They kill 80 people in Korleershoek, and they kill another 30 in Pavonia. About 130 people die. There are two descriptions of what it looked like, from De Vries and from Adrian van der Donck. Two men who were disgusted at what they saw, as many other Dutchmen were disgusted at what they saw. Not only because of the inhumanity at what they just saw, but because they knew that this just spurred an endless tirade of anger, rage, and warfare that they had not seen. De Vries says that they saw these Indians running at them, some of them missing arms, some of them missing legs, bleeding out, some of them holding their stomachs because their organs were erupting out of their stomachs. Now, they had no idea what had happened. They thought that it was a party of Mohicans or Mohawks who might have attacked them. And they said, in our ignorance, we had no idea what was going on. And it wasn't until later that they realized that it was their own people that had done this to them. Van der Donck says that he went to the parapet of Fort New Amsterdam. He went to the parapets of the fort, which is the top ring of the fort. You would have to climb up there. It's the top ring of the fort. You actually can see, you can go to places like Fort Ticonderoga, Fort William Henry, and get a kind of an understanding of what a parapet of a fort looks like. And he looked out to where Korleershoek, which is now Red Hook, and Pavonia, which is now Jersey City. He looked out, and he could hear the screams and the shrieks and the cries of Indians being murdered in their sleep, and the sounds of guns being fired. I believe it was Van der Donck who said that this was a disgrace to our nation. And these men were horrified. Kieft, on the other hand, was elated. And he said to any soldier who could bring back Raritan heads, a beaver pelt would be awarded to them. Congratulations were in order, hands were shook, pats on the shoulder, job well done were given by Kieft to these soldiers. But the colonists knew that an endless tirade of violence was going to ensue. And throughout 1644, it was not safe to live outside the walls of Fort New Amsterdam. It was not safe to live outside there. We know every farm outside of the walls of Fort Amsterdam began to be abandoned. All of the settlements outside of the fort began to be abandoned. Farms were burned, livestock were burned. Which leads us into 1645, August 30th, when the war ended. The peace treaty being made with Rotterdam and many other sachems, and a peace was made that the violence would not occur. But, according to Grummet in his work of First Manhattans, after this war concludes in 45, many of these smaller nations that had towns, had settlements in and around Manhattan, in lower Hudson Valley, into Long Island Sound were gone, were swept off the map. Whether they had amalgamated with other groups, had been wiped out, had been pushed farther inland, either north or west or south, we may never know. But the historical data tells us is that their numbers were so small and their presence was so small that their names were taken off maps and their towns were taken from them. This leads us into a small lull of a period of 44 through to 54, a 10-year lull. Not to say that conflicts aren't happening, but peace is being maintained intermittently. We even know through 1644 that even to kind of go back through to Kife's War, an important segment is we know the Wappingers up in Poughkeepsie are stopping ships going from Albany to Fort Amsterdam, stopping those ships, killing everyone on board, and taking all their stuff, bringing back to their village. This is happening back and forth over and over. And so 44 to 54 is a lull. Treaties are happening, settlements are happening, people are starting to rebuild, starting to go back. And we know a settlement began to, after 13 years of abandonment, Staten Island is again trying to be settled. The third time. I guess 3 times a charm. That's what some folks say, 3 times a charm. And so for the third time, Staten Island is attempting to be settled. Peach trees are one of the things that the Dutch bring are fruit trees, apricots, peaches. And they write about these peach trees that they bring. Vanderdonk writes a wonderful book called Discovery of New Netherlands, where he describes apricots and peaches and pears and plums and all these fruit trees that they bring to the New World. In fact, there was a peach tree planted by Stuyvesant that was in New York City till the mid to late 1800s, when it finally died. But peach trees were very important. They became a staple fruit for native people. They became a staple in their diet, as well as for Europeans. And not only would Europeans eat those fruits fresh, but they would also press those fruits and make alcohol from them, and make more alcohol from them. But to Europeans, those fruit trees were very important. Those fruit trees were part of their economy, were part of their livelihood. To our people, we had a different idea of economy and livelihood, and particularly land. For Europeans, post their tribalization, because Europeans were tribal prior to Christianity, European people were tribal, though they had different spirituality and different beliefs and belief systems. They had some shared things with North American native people. They had lost their tribal identity by this period, though some of it had remained vestiges of mythology, mostly held among Nordic peoples, Germanic peoples, and Celtic peoples, who maintained some of this mythology and old customs through these things. But to native people, we had no concept of ownership. Europeans had been taught this ownership not only by the Romans, but then by the Christians, that said that this land that I sit upon, it is mine. Christianity says I have dominion over the land and the animals and the fish, because I am a human being. And because of this doctrine, this land is mine. It is mine unto my heirs forever. As many of us have read these documents, it says, this is mine unto my heirs forever. It almost sounds like a liturgy, forever and ever. And that's how you read these documents. For our people, we did not have the same understanding of land ownership. We had an understanding of territory, of what belonged to a certain group, and what belonged to another group, but that if someone hunted a deer or a bear on someone else's territory, the custom would be that you would give the best cuts, and you were found after you had hunted this animal, you were expected to give the best cuts of meat or the pelt to that group whose territory you were in, as a sign of respect, as a sign of this is your territory and I'm acknowledging that. And people we know through the primary source documents, there were conflicts over territory. People died over territory. But ownership, as the Europeans understood and saw, there was no concept of that for us. No one could own the land forever and give it unto their heirs. No one could do that. It belonged to no one. And everyone had a shared use. That even if you belonged to a different tribe, a different community, everyone had a shared use of a river. Everyone had shared use of the territory. Everyone had shared use of a lake or a pond. Everyone had shared use. And so Europeans had a very hard time understanding this. So in 1655, following year, an Algonquian woman, we don't know if she's a Wokwoskie, Brereton, a Lenape, we don't know. An Algonquian woman picks a peach off a peach tree on the land of Hendrik van Dyke. Hendrik van Dyke doesn't like this. Spies this woman picking his peach tree. Takes his musket, primes it, loads it, sees her, and fires. Shoots her dead. You don't know if it was one shot or more, but we know she died. Now, the Algonquian people that lived in the area, they're enraged. They said, you killed this person in cold blood. All they did was take a peach. And you have many peaches. Why would you shoot someone for one single peach? You have many, and all we ask is for one. Because in Algonquian custom, the more you have, it is expected the more you should give. The person who has the most gives the most. And that's the way traditionally that we were taught to show wealth, to show status, was to give away our objects. Because they are objects, they are meaningless, they are only things that Creator will always provide us more. And so they were baffled that why anyone would do this. So they go to the Dutch court and they say, well, we demand Hendrik van Dyke. We demand that he be given to us for sentence and for punishment. Well, the Dutch refuse. And this was the last straw that the native people in this community had, the Dutch. Now from the time of from the Pig War, 1643 to Pipes War, this pot of stew has just been boiling and boiling and boiling. And no one's been adding water. Stop. It's just been getting hotter and thicker and hotter. And now it's just starting to burn at this point. And starting to stink. And the Indians now are very, very angry. And they decide that they've had enough. They've decided no more. And they decide to strike the Dutch. And they decide to strike the Dutch for another reason. Now, the leaders of this war party, it's believed this war party was around 200 native people. That's the size of one entire village going after people. That's a big war party. Your average war party is between 5 and 10 individuals. 200 is an army. And it's an army of people who are very, very angry. The head of this war party are the Susquehannocks, who sometimes are known as Ganawegos, Conestogas. There are many different names for them. Susquehanna, it's debated what that means. Some people say it means the people of the muddy water. Some people it means the snakeheads or the head of male genitalia. It is said that is another name for them. It is an insult name for them. There are many different explanations for them. They were an Iroquoian-speaking people. They lived in Maryland as well as in parts of Delaware and what we consider Delaware and South Jersey. And they did eventually migrate and get into lands in southern New York State, around the Port Jervis area into southern New York State, and were very powerful. Now, they were very close with another colony. Now, remember the early beginning of this lecture, we were going to talk about other colonies, other people. And one of these other colonies is New Sweden. Now, New Sweden was settled in 1638 by a Dutchman named Peter Menwee. Peter Menwee, who leaves the Netherlands colony, he goes to the King and Queen of Sweden and says, listen, you cats got to get into this colony game and make some real money. There's a lot of money to be made. And so King and Queen of Sweden were interested. This is King Gustav I. I believe he's known as Gustav the Fair. And this is around the 1620s. Adolphus, King Adolphus. Adolphus dies, it's put on the shelf, and then Queen Christina takes it up. And the colony is established in 1638. Now this colony lasts from 1638 to 1654, around March of 1654. Now, New Sweden ranged from South Jersey and encompassed all of present-day Delaware, and had probably and encompassed parts of southeastern Pennsylvania, so Philadelphia, Chester County, Delaware County, into Lancaster. We know the Susquehannocks, and into Harrisburg. The Susquehannocks were all in that area. That was all a part of their territory. And so the Susquehannocks, they were neck and neck with the Swedes. They were their friends and their brothers. They were their big allies. They were their big trading partners. The Swedes were trading the Indians mostly Dutch trade goods because they were funded by Dutch money and Dutch commerce. But they were trading the Susquehannocks things like muskets, things like knives, things like axes, things like woolen cloth. We even know that there was a Swedish military helmet found in the grave of a Susquehannock warrior that was found near Lancaster, Pennsylvania. So we know that other kinds of goods are being given to Susquehannock people. Now, the Susquehannocks would have viewed the Swedes as their friends and their brothers. They would have viewed them as their kindred. And so when the Swedes capitulate to New Netherlands in 1655, because New Sweden was a very little colony with very few settlers, and when they capitulate without a fight, without a shot, the Susquehannocks are angry at this. They view this as their brothers being killed. They view this as their brothers being taken away from them by the Dutch. They were also tired of the Dutch cheating them, stealing from them, and lying to them. And so they want revenge. The Lenapes, the Rarites, and other Algonquian people, possibly from Maryland and Delaware. We don't really know. It's not really known who exactly is a part of this war party. They wanted revenge against the Dutch too, for all of the things from the Pig War all the way down through Kife's War. They wanted revenge for all the men, women, and children that were slaughtered. They wanted revenge for all the land that was stolen. They wanted revenge for all the alcohol that was plied on them. They wanted revenge. This war party takes their canoes. They go from what is believed to possibly be the Delaware Bay or Long Island Sound. We're not entirely sure. And they canoe. And they canoe to Manhattan first. But Manhattan's too big of a target. And they try to hit it and they can't. However, they do kill one individual. A very important individual. Adrian Van der Donk. Schout of New Netherlands. Friend of Native people. Schooled in several Native American languages. Traded with Native people. It is said that he is killed by Susquehannocks because the local Indian people cared and loved him very much, and protected him, and cared for him, and liked him to a great degree. And so it is believed it was foreign Indians that took his life. But in this very place, Yonkers, where we are right now, is his patroonship, is the extent of his patroonship. And it was said that he was killed somewhere here, somewhere in his patroon. It was said that, you know, at the far end of his patroonship near Manhattan, near Van Cortlandt Park, it is said that's where he was killed by these Indians. So Manhattan Island was too big. So the war party goes to their next target, a place where many of these atrocities occurred, that seized with their anger reclaimed it, Staten Island. And so they paddled from Manhattan on September 15th, probably early in the morning, because that's when our raids usually were, early in the morning, dawn, or at dusk. But typically most raids, almost every document, everything you'll read, talks about our raids occurring at dawn, first light. Imagine being in Staten Island and clearing, the sun coming over the water, and on that red horizon is a triangular formation of canoes, paddling forward and forward. At first it only seems like 3 or 4 canoes, but then there's more and more and more until you realize in about 10, 15, 20 dugout canoes with 5 or 6 people in them. And they're ocean-going canoes. And they're coming towards you. We know that they took captive at least 100 people. Everyone else they killed. Livestock they killed. Barns, houses burned to the ground. Staten Island was burned for the 3rd time. And so the Peach War concludes, and a peace is made in 1661. And Staten Island was abandoned again. And this great peace of 1661, the Dutch agree to peace with Native people. They agree that they will purchase the lands fairly and equally for Native people, that Native people and Dutchmen will be treated the same in court, and that they, agree to several other clauses, those being the two largest. However, even during this period, we're getting to our final conflict with the Esopus Wars, which we'll kind of cover very briefly because I'm sure we're very short on time. Okay. And so to kind of cover the Esopus Wars, the Esopus were a small tribal confederacy living near what would be considered today Hyde Park, Kingston, over the bridge where Catskill Park begins. And the Esopus were a small community who were getting lots of encroachment from Dutch settlers that were in that upper Hudson area going towards the Kingston area, named Tireways. And they were getting plied with alcohol. Not typically from barker jugs in this period. Starting with the onion bottles. This one's a reproduction that dates to around 1660 through to around 1710, around there. And so, the Esopus start complaining about alcohol. Because their young people are being paid in alcohol. They're being paid in the alcohol. Because they work on these farms, they're working as farm hands, and they're getting paid. But they're only being paid in alcohol. They start getting into all these conflicts because they get drunk. And the chiefs say, stop selling us alcohol, stop selling us this alcohol, because it's harming our communities. And warfare ensues from 1658 through to around 1663. And in 1664, when the Dutch finally capitulate, the English say that all these conflicts are over, they are buried, and that we are starting a new leaf with the English colonies. So I'm sure I've certainly gone over time. Are there questions that people have?
No questions online yet, although many people have been asked questions in the chat.
I'm just fascinated by how we've been built up. And of course, the loss of Adrian Vanderbilt is of all people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Vanderbilt was one of these people who he was such a benefit to so many people, and it's a shame there's no statues, there's no bronzes to a man who spent his life for equality and fairness and for law, and who cared about Native people, and for a man who was born in, 1620, could see Native people as humans, as fellow members of the human race, was really advanced for his period and wanting to learn another language, their culture, their customs. And that's where most scholars say that it was a Susquehanna who probably killed him, because they didn't know who he was. He was just another Dutch face. Because the local Indians wouldn't touch him, because they knew how powerful and influential he was. He was also in charge of getting Kieft out of New Netherlands.
Yeah.
And so he was a very powerful and influential person who they protected.
Wasn't that how he got Kumail?
Right.
Because he helped negotiate.
I believe so.
Yeah.